Autopsy Doctors of Reddit, what was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. Last casualty of the Vietnam War. This was actually in the 90s, a bit before I was born actually. This does make me wonder if there's a possibility for other Vietnam veterans or Korean War veterans to possibly have a similar situation, or straight up lead poisoning. Or in the future if there's a chance for this to happen to Iraq or Afghanistan veterans. Masters in Forensic Pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed and that they didn't die from. Seen an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy, the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his circa 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain, then died shortly after. Dies of a heart attack, but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances though, saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown out skull, but police only found one bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck and into the chest. That was pretty wild. It's so wild to me how on the one side, humans can be so resilient and survive horrible things, and on the other side just how fragile and quick life can be taken from us. 2 very different extremes. Thanks for sharing your perspective. There's people out there drinking at least a fifth a day, going to work, living a seemingly normal life otherwise. Then you have someone else stub their toe and die of an infection. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit. Morbidly obese with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were paper thin. To get some reference, we figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started our neurology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tank mates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification, and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was 80 years old. They were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into the girl's face. Sad face. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interesting dissection with that information from then on, but a sobering moment in reminding our class that our cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly, and a million thanks aren't enough. I have more stories if anyone is curious. My old martial art instructor was a policeman in the 80s. He was shot with birdshot in his torso and many of the pellets were not removed. He said that sometimes they make their way to the surface and he can just scratch them out. That made me feel a bit uneasy. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with. Back when he was in school, he would do his cadaver labs really late at night, to many people during the day. One time it was really late. Around 2 AM. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones and he saw the cadaver's arm move, twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again. Proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened, but nobody believed him. Next day they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. The professor did some digging. Literally. And now I know how I'm going to prank my funeral. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claimed she died after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. My friend had to quit that job cause it was so taxing mentally. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. The sad part about this is that babies sometimes just cry. There is nothing wrong with them. They are tired and just can't sleep. It's common for hospitals to specifically warn new parents not to shake their babies, because sleep-deprived parents with colicky babies are sometimes driven to do that out of desperation. But I have never heard them having to warn specifically about slamming your baby into a wall. My wife had to watch 3 videos before being discharged with our first baby. Basically all different ways of showing that it's okay to place the baby in a safe place for 5 or so minutes to regain composure. It's better to leave them in a pack and play unattended for 5 minutes than to continue holding a screaming baby and lose your cool. But yeah, sometimes babies just cry for no reason than to cry. It's hard. I've always heard a baby can't fall off the floor. Just set them down and walk away for a few minutes. Edited to add. Fixed typo that was bothering me. My mum did that to my sister once. I don't think she was crying. My mum was just busy. She left her on a blanket in the middle of the floor in our living room and went to the kitchen for a few minutes. When she came back, my sister was gone. Of course my mum panicked and looked everywhere. She didn't know if she was going crazy or if someone had come in the house and taken her. Eventually my mum got off the floor and looked around from what would have been my sister's perspective. My sister had rolled herself across the floor under the lazy boy. It was the first time she'd ever moved by herself. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in. And whatever metal they're made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. After my mother was cremated, my sister was curious and wanted to take a peek at her ashes inside the urn. She opened it and said, "Oh." Right on top of these fine ashes was the hardware from the broken ankle repair she had gotten years before. You know, the ashes are only fine because they're ground up. Without that, you'd have chunks of bone. My friend died in college and the mum wouldn't grind his ashes. So, she gave a bunch of us some of his bones. I still have them and it's been over 20 years. So, there's a skeleton in your closet? My Grammy has lots of friends who had no family for their remains to be left to, so she always volunteered to take them. She never told us about just how many friends she did this for. When she passed away, we discovered 10 boxes of ashes. That didn't include the 2 cats and a bit of her husband, my papa's ashes. My aunt and uncle sort of got stuck with them all, as they inherited her home. My uncle passed away last Easter and my aunt died on Xmas Day. Both were cremated. My poor cousins are now stuck with 16 boxes or little urns of ashes, with no idea what to do with them. While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy and could assist. One of the lectures was to observe for head trauma. You do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissor or the like. A hollow sound is normal, but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did this exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised, as he had not been informed by the police of head trauma. They then continued to examine the head and they found a gunshot wound through the skull. All of a sudden the person was a crime scene and they had to call the police again and leave the person as untouched as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had shot himself, but it could have been a murder. How do you miss a gunshot wound to the head? What do you think killed him? Could it be that hole in the skull with blood pouring out? I don't know, I doubt it. Let's let the coroner unravel this mystery. You don't aim properly. I'm a veterinarian and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals, and one of the more notable case involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call hardware disease. Apparently the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally the farmhands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip-up do happen from time to time. Holy it. I get freaked out when my cat finds a stray rubber band, like Produce rubber band, and pukes up the chewed up remnants. I can't imagine any creature eating metal wire. We had a Christmas tree with tinsel one year. Big mistake. One of my cats kept eating it. Luckily it passed through her system, but one day she was running around the house with a long piece of silver tinsel hanging out of her butthole, trailing a fresh cat turnaround at the end. Just got anyone reading this, be careful pulling stuff out of your cat's butt. You can actually pull it into a loop around their intestines. You can cut it short until they pass it on their own, but avoid pulling it out or go to your vet if it seems urgent. You can actually pull it into a loop around their intestines. No.